Thank you very much, Schengen. I was here last week for a great discussion. I see David Orden on domestic support back this week, and I assume that in a couple of weeks we'll be back here to hear the outcome of the G20 discussion. So we can make this our living room for the next few weeks. Thank you very much, Schengen, and it's an honor to be here with this very distinguished panel. As Schengen said, I had a group called the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council. We have 40 international ag trade experts that are members of the IPC, and our work is to promote a more open and equitable trading system. So urge you to look at our website. We've got a very interesting group of people. We've been quite engaged in the topic also of price volatility, food security, and the role of trade. So this invitation was actually great because it allowed me to sort of pull together various pieces of work that we've done over the last couple of years. So what's the argument that we hear a lot now from around the world? That given the two most recent food price crises, countries are saying, oh my gosh, we're scared, we can't rely on the international markets, we're going to try to promote self-sustainability, self-sufficiency, we're going to build up reserves. This is something we hear more and more. And I think on the one hand, that's a good phenomenon because it's actually leading to a renewed emphasis on investment in the ag sector, which, as we all know, of course, has suffered a lot over the last few decades. But on the other hand, at IPC, we get a little nervous by that talk because we realize that people have lost confidence in the markets, but we don't think the conclusion of that should be to turn away from markets, but rather that the conclusion should be that we must all work to improve markets. So that's sort of how I want to introduce my remarks. I think a lot has to be done to improve international food and agricultural markets and to mitigate price volatility, it's clear. And the G20 is looking at a lot of these things, whether it's market transparency, establishing sound welfare nets, and all of that. What I will talk about today is trade policy reform in particular. So first, I will outline briefly how trade distorting policies over the last few decades have actually contributed to some of the food security crises that we've seen. Then I want to address some of the ad hoc measures that countries took during the price spikes. And then very briefly, I'll just say a few things on biofuels. And again, I want to stress that in all three of these areas that there are reforms that can be undertaken, and hopefully the G20 will come up with a really strong statement on some of these reforms. So first of all, trade distorting policies of the past. I know right now we're very focused on policies that actually increase the price of food, but I think it's important not to forget that over many decades, what we were really concerned about were policies that decrease the price of food. And in fact, it's those trade distorting policies that led to the underinvestment in the agricultural sector and to what's been defined as thin or shallow international markets. Thin markets are ones where price transmission doesn't work very well between the international price and domestic price. And there are lots of factors that can impede price transmission. Some of them are physical barriers, insufficient infrastructure, cost of energy. But again, trade distorting policies here also play a very important role. Agriculture was outside of the gambit of international trade rules until 1995. It's only with the Uruguay Round Agreement on agriculture that you actually had disciplines imposed on this sector. And that's a good thing, but those disciplines arguably did not go far enough because today, the sector actually remains quite distorted. So for example, you have tariffs on food and agriculture that are 4 times higher than tariffs on non-ag products. Export subsidies have basically been outlawed for non-agricultural products. They can still be undertaken for food and ag products. Domestic support in OECD countries has come down to some extent, but it still makes up, on average, across OECD countries, 22% of ag producers' income. So that's pretty substantial. And more than half of that actually fits into what's called in WTO parlance trade distorting support. So what's been the effect of some of these policies? It's essentially insulated domestic producers in these wealthy countries from world markets and have provided them with higher incomes. Well, the impact of that then was surplus production, which was dumped onto the international market and drove down the international price, which in turn basically was a great disincentive to agricultural investment in a lot of other countries. Now, would a Doha round fix all of this? Probably not. It would not create deeper markets overnight, but no doubt would it help. We think that some of the disciplines that have already been agreed to under the Doha round would go a long way towards creating a more open and equitable trading system. Most importantly, I think, we're looking at the elimination of export subsidies, which have actually been considered to be the most trade distorting support that's been produced. So I know it's become fashionable to declare that the Doha round is dead. I guess we at IPC still insist on its importance, and I actually thought it was quite interesting that at the event here last week, when everybody bemoaned the fact that countries are cheating on their domestic support notifications, at the same time we were basically saying the Doha round is dead. And I think we have to keep in mind that for domestic support in particular, the multilateral framework is actually going to be the only way that we can actually make some more improvements in that regard. So what we have said, if we can't reach a Doha round, and certainly we cannot by the end of this year, that a plan B, as folks are talking about, should at least try to address some of these trade distortions, and with a particular focus on development. So things like duty-free, quota-free access for the least developing countries, and some work on cotton subsidies would be very welcome. But again, a plan B should not sort of take our eyes off of the big prize, which would be an overall reduction in tariffs and subsidies. I hope that's not my phone. So let me talk now about some of the ad hoc measures that we've seen, especially during the last food price crisis. And it's very interesting to note that these measures have actually said that the purpose of these measures, whether they were export restrictions or attempts to take in more imports, they were either, the purpose was to block or decrease exports and increase imports. So if you compare that to what I've just been talking about over the last few decades, it's actually the opposite. Because back then, our key concern was with measures that are intended to limit imports and measures that are intended to expand exports. So when you look at WTO rules in this area, it's also quite striking that most of the rules that we have are dealing with some of these trade distorting policies that we were so worried about in the past. There's almost nothing on export subsidies. There's very little on subsidies that actually increase the price of food. And that makes sense because in the run-up to the Uruguay round agreement and certainly after it, the main concern was about surplus production and what that might do to international prices. So this is an area where there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Export restrictions, the FAO has surveyed, I think, a total of 81 countries. 25 of them banned exports in 2007 and 2008. And these had a huge impact. You'll hear a lot of figures about how much impact they actually had. But in rice, for example, some people think that the price of rice was tripled as a result of export restrictions. And again, you saw very, very steep price increases when Russia, in this most recent round last year, also imposed export restrictions on wheat. So these kinds of restrictions have led, obviously, to a significant decrease in confidence in markets. And they have been to the detriment of other countries, and arguably even have not always benefited the country that is imposing those restrictions. What can we do about this? The WTO, the Doha Ag modalities include some improvements to the rules, but they really don't go far enough. The G20 has talked about imposing an exemption for humanitarian purchases from export restrictions, which is good, but I think, again, it will remain to be seen whether people can actually live up to that kind of a commitment. And we would urge that more needs to be done in this regard. It's clear that countries that do not have sufficient means to provide social safety nets will look to these kinds of restrictions in difficult times. And certainly we're aware of that and need to be mindful here. But I think to view any kind of discipline on export restrictions as a threat to national sovereignty is maybe a little bit overstated. And I imagine that in the past it was equally sort of radical to talk about actually limiting your imports or opening up your imports. Sorry, that was actually considered a radical idea. But with over time and with inclusion of safeguards and rules, people have actually come to live with that just fine. So I think also we need to get across that there's a need to also include rules that actually address the rights of importers, not just exporters. The other kind of ad hoc measures that took place is that a lot of countries very quickly reduced their import tariffs when prices went up. And really, you would think a group like IPC is very much in favor of that, and certainly we are in favor of lower tariffs. But the truth is that when you do this very, very quickly, it also serves to drive up prices. So a lot of that happened. There was a lot of sort of panic purchasing. There was a lot of attempt, perhaps at the worst time, to build up reserves, because that also led to increased food prices. Let me say a few things on biofuels. There's obviously a lot of discussion about what is the impact of biofuels on price volatility, food security. So I just limit myself to a few trade-related remarks. It's clear that the high tariffs and subsidies for biofuels have distorted markets. More open international markets would allow renewable fuels and feedstocks to be produced where it is economically, environmentally, and socially feasible to do so. Again, domestic support is an interesting one here. Biofuel subsidies clearly, you can debate how much, but have clearly contributed to food price increases. Now, in the traditional WTO context, nobody complains, no producer will complain about subsidies that increase the price of food, because they actually benefit from it. But I think if we're looking now at a projected future, which most experts believe, of higher food prices, I think we need to think about what are some of these impacts, and what do we need rules on subsidies that actually lead to price increases. You could arguably even set aside sort of restrictions into that basket as well. Food aid. The traditionally WTO rules on food aid have been focused on surplus, right? You're getting rid of surplus production in the form of food aid. Well, again, in today's world, we need to think about what are the, is it difficult for humanitarian organizations to actually procure food aid? Lastly, on biofuels, we've talked about eliminating mandates or creating more flexible mandates. That's probably not in the cards politically. And we have to keep in mind that even without mandates, if the price of oil is high enough, then there will be always an incentive to produce biofuels. So there I was very pleased to see that in this paper that was put together for the G20 by IFPRI and others, they referred to an idea put forward by an IPC member that explains you could have sort of call options on biofuel feedstocks. So that's mentioned. So let me just sum up. There are lots of factors that contribute to thin markets and price volatility. G20 members have continuously called for the conclusion of the Doha round. We at IPC think now that the G20 is so squarely focused on price volatility, it would be great if they back up some of those calls for conclusion of the Doha round and actually take some concrete actions to make that happen. They will say something on export restrictions. I think agreeing to a humanitarian exemption is perfectly acceptable across all countries by now. But again, more reforms will be required in the future. And I think we need to think about the international trading system in the context of concerns about supply availability. And then very last issue that I would flag is biofuels. The question of how WTO rules apply to this sector, very, very murky. And I think it's one that the international community is well advised to look at further. Thank you.